Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Kevin Clements, the chair of the Baxter Trust, and this is the 5th Baxter Memorial Lecture. And I'll introduce our guest speaker in a moment. Just to let you know that the Baxter Trust has a number of different objectives. One of the objectives which you will have seen rolling on behind us here is that we wish to develop and have got now planning permission to develop a memorial to not only Archibald Baxter, but all the conscientious objectors in New Zealand's history, all those who were willing to disobey authority in response to the dictates of their conscience. And that memorial is as soon as we've got the $500,000, we'll be moving on that. Our other objective is to make sure that we have lectures like this that inform people about war and peace and justice issues. The third is to make sure that we're engaged in peace education with high schools and with others. And the fourth is to kind of generally act as catalysts for thinking creatively and non-violently about ways in which we can resolve the world's problems. So Richard's been distributing a little flyer for those of you who wish to. The bank is now well and truly open, and apparently it's very simple. You just go to Kiwi Bank and put in the coordinates and you can transfer enormous amount of money. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome our speaker for tonight, Maire Leadbeater. I first met Maire 54 years ago in January, where we were both on the beach at Tahuna, this playing on Neville Shute's book of the same name, On the Beach. And the point of being on the beach wasn't just so that the youth campaign for nuclear disarmament could meet and have a nice time with each other. It was so that we could remind the good citizens of Nelson and environments that nuclear catastrophe would mean the end of the world. And from that moment on, Maire and I have had different trajectories, but she has always combined passion and intellect and informed dissent, which is the point of tonight's lecture. She was born into a very radical family, Jack Locke and Elsie Locke, her mum, who deserves to be celebrated on the 125th anniversary of suffrage because she was a wonderful worker for women's emancipation, for family planning, for the rights of women. She was a wonderful role model for Maire and Alison, and for Keith, their children. Her father was a well-known Christchurch communist who spent his almost entire working life in the freezing works, I think. But I can say from personal experience that theirs was a house of creative discontent, radical thought and opinion, and very often the source of much of Christchurch's radical tradition. And Maire was born into that tradition, and out of it she came to write, which is what you need to do if you're going to be an informed dissenter, to research, but most of all to be an activist, the same activist that she was 54 years ago, working for the independence of Timor, working now for the independence of Papua New Guinea, working for social justice in the Philippines, and working for a nuclear-free New Zealand. I can't think of a better person in the whole of Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the 125th year of New Zealand suffrage, than Maire Leadbeater talk to us about informed dissent and in the tradition of Archibald Baxter.
Kia ora, everybody, and Kevin, thank you for those fulsome words, my goodness. Hope I can begin to live up to all that. And it's lovely to be here and to recognise so many friends, some of them even from Auckland, Pat. And lots of friends from all different parts of my life, and of course it's great to have my son Tim here as well. Okay, so what I want to say first of all is, of course, it is a huge honour to speak in the memory of Archibald Baxter. To me, he's an inspirational peacemaker whose dedication, of course, was tested in ways that most of us find very hard to even imagine. But I think one of the things that I'd just like to stress too is that he always stressed what he was opposed to was the military machine, and not the officers who were submerged in it, and certainly not the ordinary soldiers who fought in the wars and who helped him when he was going through his times of great extremity. Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Archibald Baxter because I'm sure I'm speaking to people who know his legacy better than I do. But yeah, he does inspire me too. And I hope that my talk will honour his legacy of standing up for principle, seeking the truth, and always being willing to challenge the state and accepted wisdom. I'm going to talk tonight about the discipline of peace research, because I think peace research, as I understand it, is aimed at understanding the military machine and domestic and international conflict with a view to preventing it in the future. But it's a little bit more than that. It's specifically understanding, in my conception, the role of our own government, what's being done in our name, and asserting the right to be part of the debate and always challenging the state, especially when the state is involved in or preparing for war or acting in repressive ways. And because it's challenging the state, it isn't respectable very often. And you may find some kinds of peace research has few funding streams available to it. And the most effective peace researchers, in my experience, will find themselves the subject of surveillance rather than being... Perfect timing. They'll find themselves the subject of surveillance rather than being the recipient of awards. I'll try and back that up as we go along. Okay, so sometimes people think of conflict as something that arises between sovereign political entities who believe they have the right to protect their interests. But that does not describe conflict in our era very well. Sovereignty is misused so often. It's used by those people who talk about humanitarian intervention, where it is really a cover for domination, exploitation, and gaining global hegemony. And to me, perhaps the most outstanding example of that is a very well-known quote from the time of the Vietnam War from Peter Arnett, a journalist who quoted this from a military man. It became necessary to destroy the town to save it. That was their attitude during the Vietnam War. So that what really counted was not, was supporting the sovereignty, if you like, of the US-backed Nguyen Van Thieu regime in Vietnam. But was it what the people in Vietnam wanted, and was it worth it from their point of view? 3 million dead. Okay, so in our time, of course, we have the so-called War on Terror, and it's provided cover to conduct bombing and drone attacks against civilians in so-called sovereign Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, right at this present time. So when you talk about sovereignty, there's a lot of fishhooks. Another one is, of course, Indonesia claims sovereignty over West Papua, and that's our government's current position. Indonesia is sovereign over West Papua, but West Papua was incorporated against the will of its people, and it's against UN customary law, which protects the right to self-determination. So what about the sovereign rights of the West Papuan people? And what about the rights of the people in Chinese territories, such as Tibet and the Uyghur territories? And of course, if we even think about our own country, in Aotearoa, sovereignty has to be at least shared, doesn't it? Because we are partners to the treaty, and we owe tribal rangatiratanga to the Maori people.
Excuse me, sorry.
Yep, doing one thing.
Your mic's rubbing or banging on something. Where's it got to? Where is your mic gone?
Aha. You warned me of that, sorry.
If you hear that noise again, just make sure it comes up.
Okay, thank you, sorry. Okay, so national sovereignty is also fatally compromised by our membership of military and intelligence sharing alliances, where vital information is shared and acted on by secretive elites and never shared with the ordinary public. And I think, to me, the prime example of that is the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, or the United Kingdom USA agreement, UK-USA. We've known about this agreement for decades, but it was actually only declassified in 2010. So I can only show you that slide tonight, and the following one, which actually shows the signatories in this last 8 years or so. But it's been around since 1946, and it's a very powerful and significant agreement. It's signed, incidentally, it's interesting when you actually look at it, it's signed by people you've never heard of because they were military officials of the time, Colonel Patrick Marr Johnson and Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, respectively. So really, who were they? But anyway, the secretive agreement has governed so much of the cooperation between UK, USA, Canada, which joined shortly later, and Australia and New Zealand, which are hooked in 1956. Okay, so just sort of moving back now to talk about the individual peace researcher. The determination to know is at its basis of an appeal to democratic fundamentals, or if you like, it's the people who are sovereign. We only delegate power to Parliament, and the checks and balances that we should be thinking about don't only apply, of course, at election time. They should always be on our mind. So I'm going to just talk just a little bit about, because it's the Archibald Baxter lecture, I'm going to talk just a little bit about conscientious objectors in World War II. I think they were in this tradition. The Christian Pacifist Society was formed in 1936. In 1938, the first CPS protest took place at a military display at Rongotai Airport on a King's birthday weekend, and a few days later they held a march alongside soldiers through the city with sandwich boards. Of course, you know about this person, not a terribly good photo of him, this is Ormond Burton. He was a regular in many forums in Wellington in the Basin Reserve. And he was both determined to bear witness and willing to take whatever came to stand up for his beliefs. So on the very eve of war, Ormond Burton and two others, Neil Trail and Michael Young, spoke out in Parliament grounds, and that got them brought before a magistrate and charged with obstructing the police and opposing military recruiting. And of course, you'll know this history, they were in and out of prison thereafter. It's common to quote the words of Michael Joseph Savage on the outbreak of war, the great ringing words, "We range ourselves without fear beside Britain, where she goes we go, where she stands we stand." I found it interesting when I read a great book, which I hope many of you will look at, by Stephen Eldred Gregg, his book Phony Wars, where he critiques the Second World War, as he has previously critiqued the First World War. And he actually said it wasn't Savage who wrote those words, it was another cabinet minister called Cornish. But despite those words, and despite that sort of, intense patriotism that they reflect, the government prior to the outbreak of war had quite a strong anti-militarist stand in those pre-war years. And Savage himself was a strong supporter of the League of Nations. And some of the foreign policy stands in the immediate pre-war years, New Zealand was willing to impose sanctions against Italy when it attacked Ethiopia. Savage himself criticised Britain for weakening the League of Nations. They had some sympathy for the Republican cause in Spain. They were uneasy about Chamberlain's appeasement. So they weren't just sort of total where Britain goes, she goes, pre-war. And even after the declaration of war, Fraser tried to get a statement of the war aims from Britain, but didn't succeed, presumably. So I just, it's just a little thing to put that aside, what actually happened once the war was announced. The different strands of opposition came together in the Anti-Conscription Peace and Anti-Conscription Council in 1940, and war fever at that time was growing really strong. So the Wellington mayor didn't like it at all, and he cancelled a rally of that body in January 1940, so they had to move it from where they'd planned to hold it into the Trades Hall, but apparently that really only sort of, dramatised the whole thing, and there wasn't enough room in the one main hall, so the speakers had to repeat themselves several times over, and the general atmosphere was really, very, very intensely interested in that meeting. So at that stage, there was a strong push. Tell the government to tell us what it's going to war about. Don't use New Zealand forces for the subjugation of colonised people. And dissenters were asking, who are we going to be fighting? And who are we going to be fighting with? Very, apt questions, really, in the light of, if you looked at just that pre-war time when Chamberlain seemed to have had a tolerance for fascism. And definitely, it was imperialist times when we were holding on to our colonial control in India and the Middle East. And these were very pertinent questions, really, because it was only as early as 1940 when New Zealand troops were sent to the Middle East where British imperialism had a strong grip. And if you read Stephen Eldred Grigg's book, there are some very, poignant bits there, because really the New Zealand troops were as racist as all get out. And there's one case where some New Zealand troops actually accidentally killed some Egyptians, but expressed no remorse. They were just considered a lesser kind of being. Pretty shocking. So I just put that against the background of the beginning of the Second World War. But of course, once the war starts, you get this tremendous heavy emergency regulations, censorship regulations, closure of any critical media such as the Communist Party press, a critical magazine called Tomorrow, and the cooperative pacifist press run by Lincoln Efford, a very well-known Christchurch pacifist. And the news is all controlled, all your mail's subject to being opened, strikes and lockouts forbidden, censors not only interested in military secrets but also any kind of political challenge, so you're not allowed to question the regulations themselves or even the fact that something has been censored. So it's pretty draconian. And in terms of the treatment of conscientious objectors, you know this better than me probably, but in no other Commonwealth country was a proportionate number of conscientious objectors imprisoned or detained, up to 800 altogether, and indeterminate sentences imposed. So it was a pretty, repressive time. I'm not going to answer the big question, were we right or wrong to take part, but at least there's a terrible irony, isn't there, in fighting for freedom and democracy by denial of freedom at home. And it's important to recognise the lingering impact that the secretive intelligence sharing and the break on freedom of dissent imposed during the Second World War. So when I was researching my book about West Papua and New Zealand foreign policy, I was really struck when I came across this protest march. This is actually a protest march in 1947, I think it is. Yes, 1947. And this is the Victoria University Social Club. And this is a time before Indonesia has gained its freedom. It's still fighting against the Dutch at this time. And these people were supporting the Indonesian revolution, if you like. And it's a student march, and they're all as tidy and beautifully dressed as all get out. Their placards are nice and orderly, and they were walking in orderly ranks of threes, according to the reports I read. But nonetheless, the police did not like it. So several of the organisers were arrested and had to appear in court. So that's the lingering impact, I think, of this stamp down on freedom of dissent and freedom of speech. And that one, I don't know if you can see that properly, I just got this just in the last few days from a dear friend, Jack Woodward, up in Auckland, and at the front of this little march is Jack Woodward and his wife Mary, and I think a little bit further back is Lincoln Efford, and they are marching on Hiroshima Day in 1959. And the interesting point about this is you'll see declassified. This came out of an SIS file, Lincoln Efford's SIS file, I understand. And I don't know if you can see it, but each adult has an alphabetical number on his or her, marked on him, so that it'll correspond in the SIS files. These are the terrible radicals: Mary Woodward, Jack Woodward, Lincoln Efford, etc. A peace march in 1959. Isn't it amazing? Okay, so now I'm going to slightly change tack. I want to spend a bit of time talking about Owen Wilkes. He's a very important figure in the Aotearoa peace movement and a very, very important peace researcher. And he was a subject of intense interest to the SIS. And he experienced detention, harassment, destruction, and interference with his personal property as a result. He left few stones unturned. Just to go back a little bit to World War II again, because he did some archival research into what New Zealand scientists were doing during World War II to support the war effort. And some of the things he uncovered surprised me and might surprise you, because New Zealand was deeply involved in chemical warfare research during World War II. And New Zealand scientists were involved in the research that led up to the manufacture of the Hiroshima bomb. And a lot of this was through the role of Sir Ernest Marsden, who was appointed Director of Science Developments for the War Effort with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. His work was mostly in radar through the DSIR, but chemical research was also significant. New Zealand soldiers did use chemical warfare shells in World War I. As far as I know, never used anything like that in World War II, but they were involved in helping with the Allies and helping to develop chemical weapons. And at the end of mines mainly, and at the end of the war, they were left with these weapons, wondering what to do with them. And according to Owen's research, they were dumped in the ocean. It's a sort of interesting issue, isn't it? And the other interesting thing when I looked at that was the RNZAF officer who was put in charge of this thought that they could be deployed in World War II, and he did not see them as being inhumane at that point in time. So it's probably just a fluke that we weren't involved with the use of chemical weapons, because the US was preparing at one point, before they decided to use the atomic weapon, they were preparing a massive assault with chemical weapons on Japan. That was one of their possible strategies. So Marsden also learnt about the US-British Manhattan Project, which worked on the atomic bomb, and he was dead keen to help, so he found some scientists who had the right skills, and they were sent to the United States and I think Canada as well, subject to security vetting and all that kind of thing. But some of them perhaps went into it without knowing just exactly what the project was going to be. But what they did work on was a thing called calutrons, which uses a magnetic field to separate U-235 from natural uranium using an electromagnetic field. And they were in the US and Canada, and it wasn't totally secret. Fraser, our Prime Minister, referred to it in August 1945 when the Hiroshima drum was bombed, but little was made of it. So, yeah, and little is made of it apparently in the official history of the DSIR. But according to Owen, it could have been quite crucial, because things were quite critical in terms of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. You know, they were racing to get there before the war was finally over. They really wanted to use it. And I suppose you could say the New Zealand scientists were helping that last-minute critical race. So it's not a good record, is it? Like so much of our involvement in wars, really. And also we were involved in looking for uranium in Fiordland. Didn't find it, fortunately. Okay, now the next thing, of course, that I think we need to remember Owen Wilkes for, rather than just his archival research, is his campaign against the US military presence. And in the 1960s, he was very much involved in opposing a US Navy plan to establish an Omega navigation system here. That was a very low-frequency transmitter, which at the time everything pointed to it being wanted by ballistic missile submarines to position themselves. This is way before GPS and all that. And they were going to place it in the Southern Alps. This is way back in 1968. A huge campaign grew up against Omega. It was one of the biggest sort of anti-war campaigns of the era. And if you know anything of your history, you know 1968 was a pretty sort of revolutionary year around the world. You know, there were great anti-war activism in campuses across America, and in Paris the revolution almost came about, and you know, it was a real time of ferment. Our ferment here, you could say, was this anti-Omega campaign, because it produced huge marches, you know, 4,000 or so on a Friday night in Christchurch, and 72,000 copies of this Cantor edition exposing what it was all about, and another militant demonstration up at Parliament. So it was a pretty big thing. And Owen's contribution, I think, to this campaign is the crucial thing, because he could see that what was needed was somebody to go and do the real research on it. So he said, I spent 10 days in the library, and then he knew what to apply for to the United States under the Freedom of Information Act and could get the information out. And eventually that campaign was won. We never got an Omega. It went to Australia. And that's the Australian one in Gippsland, Victoria. And although, it's interesting, later on it sort of emerged that perhaps they didn't use it for ballistic missile submarines, but they used it for lots of other military purposes and for attack submarines. So I don't think the distinction's all that significant. They had every reason to believe it was going to be used by ballistic missile submarines. And that stayed in use until 1997 in conjunction with 7 other similar transmitting stations. Not a terribly good photo because this was, I think it was the tallest tower in the southern hemisphere, so whoever took this photo had trouble getting it all in, but it was quite an impressive thing. Yeah, so Owen's take on why it succeeded was because of that really good information that the campaign had, and they could defeat the government at every turn because of their better information. And that went on to a whole string of different campaigns. I better speed up a bit here, not go into them in too much detail. There was Longbank and Woodburn, which was a nuclear scorekeeper. That was exposed. There was a United States satellite tracking station at Mount John, part of the space track system, providing data for targeting data for anti-satellite weapons. That was associated with the University of Canterbury. University of Canterbury was compelled to pull out. There was Harewood, where the US deep freeze operation also combined US Air Force military airlift command operation, and military planes were flying through, nothing to do with Antarctic research, but en route between US bases in Hawaii and Australia. So it was a strong campaign, and there still is today. The flights now have diminished greatly, but there are still some non-deep freeze flights going through Christchurch Airport. Okay, so Owen then took off and he went to work for the Oslo Peace Research Institute in 1976, working on US intelligence on Norwegian soil. And because he was looking too closely at what facilities were there on Norwegian soil, he and the director of the Oslo Research Institute were charged with espionage, and they were fined and given a suspended sentence. He then went on to work for the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and again he's charged. And this time it was really sort of almost amusing because really he'd been on a cycling tour, but being Owen Wilkes, he couldn't go on a cycling tour and see defence installations without stopping to sketch them and try and figure out what they were. So, he was again charged and into trouble. But anyway, he managed to get home and a big campaign to release him and so on. So he was able to come home cleared of all but minor charges. But then he came home to New Zealand and he found his West Coast house, where he was planning to go back to beekeeping work, had been demolished because it had been erected without a permit. So there's that. So he took up his beekeeping and then he found out that customs were intercepting his mail. Nobody ever found anything threatening, and there was a bit of a debate at the time, and Geoffrey Palmer, to his credit, was trying to stand up for Owen and his right to receive his mail without it being interfered with by customs on behalf of the SIS. But it certainly didn't end the SIS's interest in Owen. I'm trying at the moment to get hold of his SIS file. Owen, of course, is now sadly gone, but his brother Jack has agreed to my trying to get it again from under the Official Information Act or the Privacy Commission or whatever it is. Whether we'll get it or not, I don't know. Anyway, Owen's contribution was greater than his own. Of course, he stimulated and inspired many others, such as Peter Wills from the Scientists Against Nuclear Arms, and of course Nicky Hager. Oh, I didn't know, I'm out of order here. That's a demonstration at Harewood. That's one of where Owen was doing a sort of explaining to everybody what it's all about and so on. Police were very heavy-handed on that occasion. So that's another person, that's Bob White. He was the one who carefully followed all the Christchurch flights to see which ones were actually going to the Antarctic and which ones weren't, kept tracking them all the time, so we knew what was going on there. And Owen played a really strong role too in the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement, mapping out the militarisation of the Pacific for conferences held under the nuclear free and independent Pacific banner over many years. And then he exposed Signals Intelligence Base at Tangi Moana, a circular array for radio eavesdropping on ships, triangulating with similar bases in Australia, as that illustration from Peacelinks shows. And it was really interesting, it was really hard to discover. He knew that he was aware that New Zealand was going to get this base. He didn't know exactly where it was. He thought at first they might put it somewhere near Waiouru, but finally tracking down where defence radio operators worked, because New Zealand's got a fairly open system, and you can see these people in phone books and civil service lists and so on. He, with the help of some others, including Nikki Hager and Alistair Barry, was able to suss out that was it. In fact, Alistair Barry, when I wrote my book, Peace, Power and Politics, he's really excited about that part of his history, because he said, we discovered Tangi Moana just on a trip along the coast there near Fielding. And also, that's another one of Tangi Moana, nuclear target in the Manawatu. And also Black Birch, a naval observatory funded by the United States, needed for mapping the stars with the accuracy needed for missile guidance. So that's Marshall at the time saying, Russell Marshall, what have we got to worry about? Why are they getting concerned about it? But we were. It was quite a focus of peace movement activism at that time. And again, Peter Wills, just by chance, he happened to be working in Washington, and he came across a planning hearing for an apartment building, and the objection came in from the US Department of Defence, because the apartment building would block the parallel observatory in Washington, which was combined with the Black Birch one. And then, of course, getting right... Oh, yes, do you like that one? The road to nuclear hell is paved with scientific intentions. That was one of the slogans on Black Birch. Okay, getting right up to Waihopai now. I think this is something to be proud of. Waihopai is such a significant part of our contribution now to US intelligence and the Five Eyes network. But we were aware that Waihopai had a sinister side to it before it was even built. So the protest to Waihopai began even before it was built. And that's because of the wonderful research of people like Owen Wilkes. So we were sort of really ahead of the game, I think, at that time. And we know that now that Waihopai is part of the Echelon system, worldwide signals intelligence detection run by the UK-USA agreement, or the Five Eyes, through the GCSB, the parent agency of Waihopai. And New Zealand, according to what we hear from people like Edward Snowden, our contribution to signals intelligence is disproportionate to our size. And it means, of course, that we are potentially implicated in the war on terror. Because where does this intelligence go? Back to the American National Security Agency, NSA, and since 2009, we know, again, with the help of people like Edward Snowden, that it is what they call full take collection. So we don't have any say over what gets passed on. And we know that the information has been used against our friends, our trading partners, and our neighbours, right down to an anti-corruption campaigner in the Solomon Islands. Snowden told us that they've been using X-Key Store since 2009, way of filtering out the intelligence, political intelligence that they want. And it could potentially be used, it's always very hard to track these things down exactly, but it could potentially be used for helping to identify targets for drone attacks using data from people's cell phones. But we protest. Even as recently as 2003, of course, we were protesting against the GCSB and its extension of powers to cover New Zealanders as well. So I just want to go on finally and say, yes, we really need people like Owen Wilkes who seem to be able to suss things out before they even hit us, and research is so vital. But can we find out things without using whistleblowers, without using these really skillful researchers? Can we use the Official Information Act? We should be able to, shouldn't we? Because that's what it was set up for. with these high ideals of every government department being accountable, all information is open unless there's strong reasons for withholding it. Those are all the things that were said about the Official Information Act. But unfortunately, and this is where I get unstuck all the time, there's one area in the Official Information Act which says, I'll just give this little quote from Danks, Alan Danks, who was proponent of the OIA in the first place. One general area for which it is generally accepted that protection is needed can be collectively described under national interests. It includes such fields as security, defence and international relations. We consider that the maintenance of law and order and the substantial economic interests of New Zealand also merit assurances of protection so that the government can operate in the best interests of the public as a whole. So it sounds all very nice, doesn't it? But what will prejudice our international relations? Who decides what our national interest is? Is it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade? And is it the Ombudsman? Because they think, this is where I get angry, definitely they think, it is in our national interest to protect the sensitivities of Indonesia. So when I asked for a document under the Official Information Act, interested to know what our diplomats saw and found out when they went to visit West Papua, what did they find out about the human rights situation? What did they find out about security forces, impunity and things like that? I get a report back which has those key things blanked out, redacted. So there might just be a little heading so I can guess that they discussed that area, but I don't know what they said. And then I go to the Ombudsman and he said, no, Section 6C protects the government's international relations, protects Indonesia's sensitivities, that's what that means. So I'm not very happy with the Official Information Act and the way the Ombudsman is treating his role with regard to the Official Information Act. Okay, so what I want to just finish off with is I think we are lacking at the moment, and I don't know how we're going to put it right, but I'll just put it out there. We are not watching our increasingly close relations with UN's defence strategies. We signed a thing called the Washington Declaration in 2012, and full intelligence ties were restored even earlier, full intelligence ties with the US. See, we think we've got this cut off, don't we? Since we went nuclear free, we think we're at a distance. But I don't think that's real any longer. We restored full intelligence ties in 2009, and, you know, Helen Clark committed us to troops to Afghanistan during her period. And WikiLeaks government documents, you can see New Zealand government documents released by WikiLeaks, you can see them commenting very approvingly about Helen Clark and how she strenuously avoids saying anything critical about US relations. She put key people in positions favourable to the US, such as, the GCSB director and SIS directors, Warren Tucker and Bruce Ferguson. They were both people that the US was very happy with. And what happened just this week under the current government, we renewed our deployment commitment to Iraq. Earlier we extended our commitment to Afghanistan. We have bought new planes, P-8A Poseidons, you know, surveillance planes for going off and working with our allies. They're not for defending New Zealand. 2.3 billion, or 2.39 billion I read in the Herald yesterday on the Poseidons. What could we do with that for real security? Housing, kids, poverty, 2.3 billion. And we're still involved in exercises with a counterinsurgency nature. One down in the South Island you might have known about called Southern Katipo, back in October, November. Anyone who lives from the Nelson area probably knew about them because they went right across Nelson, Marlborough, the west coast, where we're practising against a fictional South Pacific nation, restoring law and order, so to speak, and doing all kinds of role-playing. Well, if there was a conflict in the Pacific, would we be a good person to have on side? What would we be supporting? I mean, the tragedy to me is, when I look at the Pacific, there's so much we could do that doesn't involve anything military, and we blinking well don't do it, you know. I mean, I've worked on East Timor, trying to get our government to take a stand and raise it at the UN. All those years that Indonesia was occupying East Timor, we would not stand up for them. Only right at the very end we sent in peacekeepers. Well, that was all right, but we didn't do anything when we could have prevented those things. And now I'm watching it happen with West Papua, and I'm getting angry all over again. Sorry, I can't help it. I mean, look, there's a nation in our Pacific that is standing up for West Papua. It's Vanuatu, a little nation of 20,000 people. They are proposing something non-radical. Just, can we please take the issue to the UN Decolonisation Committee, right? They're preparing the way for this. They say they'll take it to the UN General Assembly in 2019. They're realists. They know they haven't quite got the backing they need yet. They just went to the South Pacific Forum. Couldn't even get it mentioned in the communique because so many small Pacific nations are really under, checkbook diplomacy, and that's working hard to stop them speaking out. But New Zealand could have spoken out. What would it take just to say, all right, let's ask the UN to look at it then? What would that take? But no, we don't do it. And then we talk about having these counterinsurgency games. It makes me angry. So I'll stop there.